equity itself can be, while it is certainly the goal, can be a bit of an abstraction. And it can also take people into kind of a technical direction or numbers orientation. And so I was really intrigued that when I used the frame of belonging, it shifted for folks.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Susie Wise. Susie is a designer, educator, and author whose wonderful book, Design for Belonging: How to Build Inclusion and Collaboration in Your Communities, came out in April 2022 as part of the new Stanford d.school book series on core design skills. She teaches at the Stanford d.school and coaches leaders in innovation practices and liberatory design. We spoke at the end of June 2022, and I've been excited to talk to Susie and the other authors of the d.school's new series as soon as I ordered the books online, but Susie in particular, because I think understanding belonging and the lack of it is a crucial piece in solving many of the world's most challenging problems, which are, by and large, problems of cooperation. I got even more excited once I opened the book and found real principles and practices for building belonging in your team, your classroom, your organization, and references to other valuable authors and materials. I don't think it's possible to be fully happy without experiencing belonging with friends, with family, with your community, or with your team. And yet, for so many of us who may have different backgrounds, different ethnicity, different body types, that feeling can be elusive, especially if the culture or leadership does not pay attention to promoting belonging. It turns out that belonging can have other systemic effects, like how will you do at school or at your job, how safe you feel to bring up issues to management, how invested you feel in the shared outcomes for your team, company, nation, maybe even humanity itself. Is it any surprise that people who feel excluded, ignored, judged, or invisible may not be putting forth as much of an effort as people who feel seen and appreciated? I found the discussion with Susie fascinating, and we dive right into the topic of belonging and how to foster it. We talked about the need for belonging in troubling times, what being bored at school taught Susie about herself and the world, how she moved from politics to design and got involved with the Stanford d.school, her work in the K-12 lab at d.school, which combined design thinking with Montessori education systems, moving from design thinking in education to liberatory design and design for belonging. What is belonging? What does it look and feel like? Why does it matter? What is othering and how it works? The importance of ritual, storytelling, and spaces in crafting belonging. As someone who's researched religion through a designer's eye, I love the emphasis on ritual, spaces, and storytelling in crafting belonging. All of these areas which religions are famously good at utilizing, whereas secular environments often fail entirely to appreciate. But what if a school made you feel as welcome and as part of the community as the best churches? What if the rituals we crafted and the stories we told included every one of us? Since this interview with Susie, I've already interviewed a few of her co-authors in the d.school new book series, which will be coming out in the next few weeks. This conversation is one of perhaps a dozen weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, entrepreneurs, and activists who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now, let's jump right in with Susie Wise. All right. I'm sitting here with Susie Wise. Susie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have a lot going on in the news. It seems like there's never a moment where that's not true. But over the life of this podcast, we had COVID, and then we had the war in the Ukraine, and now there's a lot of stuff coming out of the Supreme Court. And so what's it like to be you today?
Oh, wow. That's a profound question. I'll say this morning in my meditation and yoga, I was really working with grief, just a lot of sadness for ongoing discord and turbulence and taking away of rights, here in the US context.
Yeah.
Matters to me a lot. And so thinking about how to respond and be a part of the conversation and figure out what is my work to do.
Yeah. And as someone who facilitates and creates these spaces for conversation, for better communication, the country is so divided and so polarized and these topics go so deep that you can't have any sort of dialogue around them, and it's just who wins in any given moment.
Yeah, so the difficulty around creating community where community can be a container for differing opinions still has to come from a fundamental set of the rights of individuals and communities to stand up for themselves and to articulate what they want and need. So belonging is really important in this moment. But it's interesting because I was very clear on how belonging was a part of racial reckoning after George Floyd was murdered, and how belonging was a part of recovering from the pandemic. And in this moment, facing the Supreme Court decision, both on guns and on abortion rights, we knew it was coming, so it's not a surprise, and yet it's still really upsetting. And so what is belonging and the need to design for belonging in this moment? I feel like I'm thinking about that a lot. I know that belonging is a fundamental human need. And so it's going to be a profound part of how people come together, how people organize. It's also is, as you're mentioning, a part of figuring out how to have conversations and do work together across difference. We have to be able to assure mutual safety and belonging as a human need in order to work through differences.
Yeah. And it feels like belonging in a place, belonging in your country, even when you deeply disagree with something that's happening in your country, is something that's probably part of it from the internal side as someone who feels now alienated by something like that.
Yes. And every individual, and even within groups and communities, we have multiple identities. So it's a really interesting question of which identity are you leaning into to support yourself, to get up and keep going? Which identities are you leaning into as part of your work? And which identities are maybe feel confusing or fraught in a moment when the ground is shifting?
No. Yeah. And it may be that this is allowing us to experience what it's like for people who, feel alienated for decades and generations. Right?
Absolutely. One of the things so in the book, Design for Belonging, is organized around feeling, seeing, and shaping belonging. And the feeling part really matters. Belonging is a feeling. And what I've found is helpful about lifting up belonging as something to design towards or design for it to emerge, because you can't design it. You can only design things that let it emerge. But that's really important to reckon with it as a feeling. And then, as you say, to recognize, wow, I've had a lot of belonging in my life. I might now be feeling less belonging because of whatever's happening in the news. And that helps us to recognize folks who much more consistently, because of the structures and systems that organize our world, have very rare opportunities to feel belonging or don't get to feel belonging in public forums very often.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm trying to bring it back to Israel, because Israel has a lot going on that we don't agree with or we don't support. And my Israeli friends fall into two buckets. The ones that are constantly talking about leaving. They never leave, but they're constantly talking about, I don't belong here. What am I doing here? And then they have some excuse for why they're staying. It's like it's too hard. And then the other group is, no, this is my country. I'm going to stay. I'm going to fight. I don't know if I'm going to win, but I'm committed to this relationship and to this belonging. And those are the people who seem to actually make a difference, also in the end, in what the country does for the better. I think it's a choice to some extent, right? Do I commit to this belonging?
That's right. And design is a choice, right? Design is about taking intentional action to create the world you want to see. And so the reason I wanted to bring together the notion of belonging as this human feeling that we need in order to show up, be ourselves, contribute, combine that with design is to say, again, as I said, you can't design belonging because every individual is going to feel it how they feel it, but you can design all kinds of things that can help bring it forward and allow people to tap into it in new and different ways. And so that intention, that commitment to design, I think is really profound.
Yeah. And you talk about design, and behind you, I see all of these design objects on your wall, all these bags and this lovely owl, and they're very beautifully laid out. Just had to mention it for the people who can't see it.
Yeah. And it's an important thing, too, to say, right? There is that way. Sometimes the word design for us evokes the beautiful layout or the beautiful installation or the beautiful website or logo. And it's really important. And certainly in the d.school context, we really like to think about design as actually a creative problem-solving methodology that all kinds of humans can engage in and that we can use to build the systems that actually shape our world.
Mm. So there's a question we usually ask in the beginning to find our way into the person that we're talking before we get into their work. So that's my question to you. What's something you've learned early in life that still drives or guides you today?
Thank you. I love that question. So, and I had listened to a couple of your podcasts, so I knew you were going to ask that question, and I didn't prepare an answer, but I found that I really enjoyed thinking about it. So thank you for the question. And it took me back to middle school. And middle school, I was a really frustrated student. So imagine 12, 13-year-old Susie. And, there was a lot going on at home. And so school was kind of my place to shine. But I was also often pretty bored. And so one of the things I discovered in that time was that it really made much more sense to me to work hard on something when I felt like it mattered. I look back and I became a kind of project-based kid. And I carried that forward into my pedagogy now in terms of design. But really, for me, it was about trying to work on projects where the outcomes would matter. So for instance, I was often bored in class, but I would figure out how to get the teacher to let me go do a project. So I remember I ended up organizing a citywide canned food drive, which meant that I got to do my homework really fast and then get out of class and go around and collect cans so that we could give food to the food bank in our town. And that's kind of a thing that has stuck with me. And I bring it forward to this conversation in terms of design for belonging. Part of what this book is about is encouraging designers and leaders of all kinds to consider the state of belonging in their team or their organization or the work that they're doing. That belonging for me right now is that thing that matters. And I would love to help us turn our attention towards building more belonging.
And so were you interested in design right off the bat? Because I know you studied that and you eventually got the PhD in learning sciences and technology design. But was that early on in your childhood, in your early life, or how did you find yourself doing that?
It wasn't at all. I was a kid who was focused on politics, so student government, and in high school, statewide student government. And I went to college with the idea that I would go into politics and work on Capitol Hill. And I did work on Capitol Hill during college.
Nice.
And in fact, in my last year of university, I had a job to go be a legislative assistant for the congressman that I had interned with. And at the last minute, I thought, ooh, all those boys in blue blazers. Maybe not. Maybe I didn't want to go and just be the lowest person in the politics. Maybe someday, if I had something to contribute from a policy lens, perhaps I should go back, but that I needed to start somewhere else. So I always thought I was going to be in politics. I did not study design. I studied history, I studied French, I studied art history. And so instead, I didn't go to DC. I moved to the Bay Area and I started working in education and thinking that might be a policy arena that I cared about and could work in. I was trying to work for nonprofits that were working in education, and I found a few interesting ones and ended up working in HIV and AIDS education. And that kind of led me on the path that ended up landing me in some technology design work. But it really started from a space of community-based learning experiences and how you could offer those. So I didn't come out of design. What I found when I landed at Stanford to do a doctorate in the learning sciences and technology design, that was really about having spent then many years thinking about learning experiences and designing learning experiences, both software-based and video-based in the real world, in museums and other kinds of organizations, that I had developed. I didn't know what human-centered design or design thinking was, but I had some instincts that were towards that. So when I landed at Stanford and I took a class, at the time it was called ambidextrous thinking. And I took this class that was introducing the framework of human-centered design. I was like, oh, there's a name for it? Wow, that's my method. So I wasn't schooled as a designer until quite a bit later in my career. And I found that the empathy orientation of observing in the world and then the kind of moving quickly and trying things, the prototyping orientation, were really how I had been working. And now I had a name to call the method.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, someone told me years ago, if you want to find out what you're meant to do, go back to your, when you're in the shower, what your brain just naturally goes to when you're not trying to control it. And I was like, that's not helpful at all, because my brain always goes through like world problems and how to fix them. and then years later, I realized when I started learning about design thinking, and I realized that's the methodology. Whenever whatever project I was involved in, that's really the driving thing. And so,
yeah. For me, the version of the shower is I'm often out in the world trying to listen and observe, notice, and care about what's happening. And then the shower time for me is the what if. Oh, we could try this. Oh, we could try this. We could try this.
Exactly.
That's what happens in the shower, is where the ideation and then idea kind of nuggets of prototypes come. So I can get out of the shower and then call or email someone to say, hey, do you want to try this? What if we stood on the corner and talked to people about this idea?
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so you actually started the K-12 lab at the d.school. Tell me a little bit about that. How did it start before we go into belonging? How did you bring your interest in education into the d.school?
That's great. A couple things to say about that. One is that because I was a doctoral student in the School of Education, I had a number of years, and then it happened to be that the folks that were starting the d.school, David Kelly and George Kemble, came to the group of students that were taking that class and said, have this idea to spread this methodology. You all seem like you're interested. Do you want to try building some of the experiments so that we can build this d.school? And so I followed along that path. And David Kelly was often saying that he knew that one of the challenges that students cared about that we should work on was change in K-12 education. And I was just struck by that. And I think it goes back to the story that I was telling you about myself as a middle schooler, always wanting to get out of class and do projects. We could redesign education to work in these project-based ways. And that just struck me. And so we started by prototyping an innovation lab. We started by prototyping curriculum. And we started by prototyping ways to introduce design thinking to educators. And all of those projects had such positive feedback. And also we saw educators' desires to change and evolve their school contexts. So whether that was redesigning their classroom procedures or rituals, or folks that were trying to redesign their whole high school, and also folks that were designing new school models. And so we just started working where people were interested in using design and design thinking to create the change they wanted to see. And it turned into a national and international movement of design thinking in K-12 education.
That's awesome. And when you talked about project-based, I heard Montessori. I was like, so you're trying to turn it into a Montessori school, and you are involved in Montessori schools today. So what's the connection between Montessori, which was an existing system, but that's very has a lot in common with that design thinking approach?
Sure. So Montessori had been around for 100 years when I started working on bringing design thinking into education, schools, and classrooms. And I got involved in Oakland, California, the city where I live here in the US, with a group of parent educators who had children that had experienced Montessori and wanted them to be able to carry on kind of through primary school, through elementary school, using Montessori methods. And I joined that group and we designed a school called Urban Montessori Charter School here in Oakland, California, that intersected the 100-year-old Montessori methods of student-centered work with design thinking as a kind of contemporary toolkit to build creative muscles with children and to use them to solve problems right here in our town. The Urban Montessori model combines Montessori education with design thinking and also with arts integration so that students would have access to understanding their ways of learning. That's a huge part of Montessori, is knowing yourself as a learner. And then knowing yourself as a learner, if you're noticing and caring about what's happening in your community, can you use design as a positive problem-solving toolkit? Maria Montessori, who created that method in the early 1900s, was very much a proponent of using the tools of your time. So even though her method, right, is from more than 100 years ago, we really thought that design thinking was one of the tools of our time that we wanted students to be able to use.
Cool. Yeah, and Montessori is definitely continuing to develop and expand, and there's networks of schools now that take it all the way to high school, and I look at it and I'm very jealous because I've had a very different schooling, and I think that's the common reaction when people see.
Yes, and that's true for many people, and you're right. And one of the things that we were really trying to do here in Oakland is make Montessori a public offering. So in a city like Oakland, could we introduce Montessori so that families of all income levels and racial identities and backgrounds would have access to that methodology? We named it Urban Montessori really as this reflection on what we hoped it could be in a city like Oakland.
I want to take you to belonging and to inequity. I would like to understand that aha moment where you realize that's the next challenge, that's what you wanted to tackle.
Absolutely. So I had been working for a while, and really the founding of the K-12 lab in my mind had an underlying equity agenda that we were hoping to use design thinking to help build more equitable schools. And at a certain point, also recognized that agenda wasn't forward enough, that wasn't explicit enough. And so part of the work of getting more explicit about how we could use design to create more equity in education broadly was developing a framework that we called liberatory design. We worked with colleagues at the National Equity Project to think about how a deeper equity lens could be revealed by using design. And they were interested in thinking about how a design lens could assist the way that they shared equity practices with the folks in their network. I was simultaneously working on a project with school leaders to think about how to use their design mindsets to change their school cultures. Definitely with an orientation towards equity and supporting students furthest from opportunity. as we were kind of looking at that curriculum and the way we were supporting leaders to use design mindsets to create change in their schools, I was having a conversation with one of my mentors from the National Equity Project, a gentleman named Victor Carey. And he just very simply handed me a 2-page excerpt from John Powell and Stephen Menendian on the framework of othering and belonging. And I was struck by it, and I decided to prototype with it. So that's my orientation, right? I have my shower time, and then I have a prototype I want to do. I wanted to use that same excerpt with the next group of school principals that I was working with and just see, did it help them get clearer on their equity lens for their design work? And what I found was just raising the notion of belonging as the feeling that you are trying to design towards was incredibly helpful for them. Equity itself can be, while it is certainly the goal, can be a bit of an abstraction. And it can also take people into kind of a technical direction or numbers orientation. And so I was really intrigued that when I use the frame of belonging, it shifted for folks. They suddenly could remember a time that they felt belonging, a time they didn't feel belonging, and really got motivated in a new way to build more belonging with and for the students in their schools that were furthest from opportunity. So I was just kind of shocked. It was an incredibly successful prototype, and it was just a prototype. I was just asking the question, if I use this and introduce belonging, might that shift the educators' mindsets? And it really did. And so then I felt like, oh, on to something here. I really want to put that forward. And there may be a next important word that we need to get to, right? But in this moment, I found that it helps, that it shifts people to a more active stance than just thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that you get to what is the real feeling that we're trying to get to.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow a podcast. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So I want to dive into the book, and the book is that I have behind me. I just have to say, it's a lovely book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just a joy with the illustrations and the fold outs. And I found the little illustrations also so helpful with the little charts. For instance, how does belonging feel? How does othering feel? Mind maps.
Yeah, the mind maps. Yeah, so there's a mind map of what does belonging feel like and what does othering feel like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I love those too.
Amazing.
And another shout out. So the artist and illustrator is a mural artist named Rose Jaffe. She just absolutely got what I was going for with this book. So I also feel like the illustrations really help it. They bring it alive, but they also, I'm hopeful that they help turn the book into not just something that you read, but something that you use.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes it feel inviting, and it makes it feel like I want to carry it with me sometimes, and I want to open it more often than I would like a thick book with a lot of text in it.
Yes. And open it and try it, right? Try an exercise, right?
Yeah.
Open it in your next meeting and think about, hey, let's all do a journey map of belonging over our last week and see where that takes us and what kind of a conversation that could generate.
Yeah. And so I'm going to start from the start. So I'm going to ask you what is belonging. I want to frame it with this quote that you have in the book from Brené Brown, which is, I think, is really lovely. True belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. So what is belonging? Is it a state? Is it what? How do you define it today?
Yes. So that definition that you shared from Brene Brown, I really like that. And I think of that as the definition of the most evolved version of belonging. That's that belonging that you carry with you wherever you go. In the context that you're in, you still have that confidence in a way that you belong or that you can belong. But it's not always like that. So the starting places of belonging are really knowing that who you are, your whole self, is welcomed and that you can make a contribution, that you're honored. And I go further too. The John Powell quote that I use further in the book is also to say that belonging is more than just being seen. Belonging entails having a meaningful voice and the opportunity to participate in the design of social and cultural structures. So he takes it all the way to that place of, if you belong, you're meant to really be a part of something. Belonging is beyond just fitting in. It is getting to be who you are in your context.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And we also have this quote from Christine Wong Yap about belonging happens when people feel safe, seen, and accepted. I love that. And you describe, you have a whole chapter about what belonging looks like. If we look at a group or at a community, how do we identify belonging?
Yeah. So the thing that I'm doing in the second chapter, so once you're clear on what belonging could feel like, when and where you may have felt it, when and where others that you're working with may have felt it. The seeing belonging really matters because that's breaking it down. Belonging is not a monolith. Our experience is not just one thing. So in seeing belonging, I'm inviting us to consider what are some moments where belonging really shows up. We've used the word here, welcome or invited. Those are really important moments. We've also talked about having a meaningful voice and the opportunity to participate in the design of social and cultural structures. I also talk about the moment of dissent. So what is it to actually have to say, this is not working for me. I don't feel comfortable with this. This system makes me feel like I don't belong. That's a really profound moment to design for as well. And I lay out 9 moments in the book, but I also offer the invitation to everybody to think about in your context, whether you're thinking about your family or a team at work or a larger organization that you're part of or your town or your city, to think about what are some concrete moments that you could design for greater belonging. It becomes a really powerful tool to see what those moments are and to differentiate. You may have been a part of an organization where you felt really invited to join, but then unclear how to make an authentic contribution. The moment of contribution is a powerful indicator of belonging. And if you don't feel like you can make a contribution, it may be that that's the moment to work on. So the moments then become ways to get very concrete. The power of design is in specificity and creativity and specificity. So get to those concrete moments and design them.
Yeah, I love the inclusion of, because many of the other ones are this maybe softer, like the invitation, the welcome, the participation and contribution, and dissenting as an example of belonging. If you feel like you can dissent.
I mean, in a way, it's a measure of belonging, right? You wouldn't bother to dissent or raise issues potentially if you didn't want to deepen your belonging.
No. And so I want to take the point of view of someone who's a little bit more cynical, and he hears this interview so far, and he's like, I'm saying my mind just goes to he for some reason. But it's like, yeah. Why does everybody have to feel good all the time and fuzzy-wuzzy? Like, why is this important? Is this really critical or just like a feel-good thing to add on?
Sure. Well, a couple things to say is one is it's not only feel good, right? Because dissenting, making an authentic contribution may or may not feel good. And yet belonging may be at play. So that's one thing to think about. But why does it matter? Well, it actually really matters. There's a fair amount of social psych research, both in the education field and in workplaces, that belonging is a fundamental need that folks have in order to contribute. Or in the learning context, in order to learn, you have to be able to see yourself as belonging to a learning community. You see yourself as a learner when you feel belonging in a learning community, and that actually enables you to learn more. So that's fundamental. So that's schools, that's workplaces, that's family life, that's community life. If we want to be able to achieve almost anything, belonging is fundamental to it. So it's not fuzzy wuzzy, it's fundamental.
Yeah. There's even studies from Google showing that psychological safety was the single best predictor of effective teams. And psychological safety is all about feeling like you belong, you're safe, you're seen, you're respected.
Yeah, it's a key component of it. And the thing is, right, the other thing that we know from psychology is that as humans, we are incredible at picking up cues in our environment for our safety and for our belonging. And so we are primed as humans to do that. So we are doing that constantly.
So this brings me to the opposite of belonging, which is othering. And we also talk about systemic othering. So what is it? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, so that's the question, and that's the orientation for this book. So othering itself, also a feeling, the feeling of being othered. So that's unwelcome. It's also projected upon, which means that not being seen for who you are, but being seen in some way as a stereotype or as only a part of your identity that's not the part that you're trying to bring forward in a given moment or context. So othering is profound. That's how it happens or what it can feel like on an individual level. And then, of course, systemic othering is the excluding all the way to the extremes of segregation, excluding people based on a particular identity or trait. It can look like that in its extreme form. But it's also, again, back to the psychological cueing, it can also be very subtle. And that's what leads to then a deterioration of how people can participate and contribute.
Yeah, this reminds me many years ago, I was sitting in meditation at a meditation group in New York, and they gave us a new exercise. It was part of a class, and they gave us a new exercise, which is called metta meditation, where you're wishing well. And you're expanding the circle and you're wishing well. And I think that was a moment where something in my brain shifted because something worked there, because I emerged from that room and I suddenly saw everyone in the street that I've been ignoring and blocking off. And I have this really clear memory of this older Black woman carrying a very heavy bag. And I just emerged from that place and I said, oh, she's really struggling with that bag. It's really heavy. And I mean, I didn't feel like I could help in that situation, and she was going into the subway. But just the fact that I saw it and I knew that a few hours ago I wouldn't have. And something happened to my eyes. And in retrospect, I think that's the subtlety that's so ever present by who we see and who we don't see, who we acknowledge and who we don't acknowledge. It must be such a powerful. It's an aggregate. Must be such a powerful thing to experience from the other side. And I don't know. Because I've mostly been in I'm a Jewish white guy, and I've mostly been to Israel and the US, and I'm not really experienced that. I'm used to
Uh-huh.
being seen. I'm used to being,
Yeah.
you
Yes.
know,
Yes.
I'm used to taking a lot of space.
Yes. Just jumping in on the meta meditation, I think it's very powerful to think about. I've done some of that practice in my life, and often when led, there's the offering to yourself, to someone close in, and then also to someone further out, maybe
Right.
someone that you're right have a negative even relationship with. It's a cool analog to bring into this conversation because I think thinking through those layers is part of the work that we even as individuals are actually always part of more than one part of an identity, more than one part of a community. And then the other piece that you're calling out there is, and referencing back to the school I helped to start in Oakland, Urban Montessori, we situated the design thinking process for young people as starting with notice and care. And so the work of noticing who is getting to feel belonging when and where, and then caring about it, not just noticing, but caring about it. That's what sets you up to take a kind of designerly action, to wonder further, how might I help someone with a heavy bag? And how might I help someone with a heavy bag in a more systemic way too? We can start to ask that question when we do the noticing and caring at a close in level. We can still ask ourselves the question about the system. And then from my perspective, I really advocate for then also, again, working at a small scale to understand if the kind of change you're trying to create gets created.
Yeah. That is super important, obviously, but I think it's maybe important for me to say even just the acknowledgement is a powerful thing of seeing, just seeing and caring is a very big deal for, because of what it feels like when people don't see you and don't care.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And on that level, I mean, just imagine if in every context we were part of, say in our day, in our week, folks were paying attention to belonging, caring about who seemed to be able to receive the invitation, to contribute, to be honored in that group or context, that would fundamentally shift things. So it becomes an invitation for greater design, but I agree with you 100% that the noticing and caring about it is powerful in and of itself.
And I think that some of these things, once we notice and care, almost happen of their own accord. We just want to do something about it, and we're together, and so we're starting to work on it together. And
absolutely, it primes you, and you don't actually stop there.
Yeah. So there's a couple of exercises that you have in the book that are very interesting. One of them is, and feel free to talk about others as well, but this one caught my eye, the assumption storm.
Yeah, it's been so intriguing to me. The assumption storm is catching a lot of people's eye. It's an excellent exercise. Assumption storming is kind of a classic design exercise, often used to set up brainstorming, but it can be used as a kind of analytic tool as well. So the notion with assumption storming is to think about your context. So specifically, the example I use in the book are some folks that are leading an after-school program. And so they think about what are all the assumptions that we have about this program, that it's after school, that you have to be enrolled in it, that it's just kids from this school, that it happens in this particular place. Like they can go on and make a whole list. And you can, when you're assumption storming, you want to go as broad as you can and say those basic things. Like when we run an after school program, you still have to say it's an assumption that it happens after school. Because the thing is, it could happen all kinds of different times, your program, but you've constrained it with your assumption that it's in after school. So you list out all of your assumptions, and then you're in a position to question them, to try and flip them. So is it after school? Oh, where else could it be? It could be before school. It could be at lunchtime. It could be during class. It could be, right? You can flip those in as many ways as you want. And it doesn't mean you have to do it, but you're giving your mind the opportunity to both see the assumptions and also notice what else would be possible if you weren't constrained by that assumption. So it's very powerful in that way to just open your mind about the context in which you're working. In the story that I share in the book about this after school program and their assumptions, they ended up digging into, they had this assumption that you had to be enrolled. And they noticed when they dug into that assumption, that's where they felt a real tension around othering and belonging, that there were often kids that weren't enrolled and they were telling them to leave the space, leave the building. No, you can't be here. It felt very negative, and they recognized that they were embodying themselves, and they were also modeling a kind of othering that wasn't necessarily needed.
And so, the last part of the book, you talk about shaping belonging, and that's made up of so many different levers or different components that you could use. You mentioned rituals, you mentioned space, roles, communications, even clothing and food. I love all of those. I'm especially curious. Well, I guess someone who has a lot of rituals at work, like, stand-up meetings and I care about these rituals. And as someone who also studied religious studies and knows the role of ritual in spiritual life, I would love to hear more about that. Do you have any examples for how rituals can really shape a sense of belonging and any other examples you want to give to this shaping?
Yes. So, and I love that you love the focus on rituals. It's really important. Humans really need them, and belonging and ritual can go really hand in hand in beautiful ways. I think in this moment, there's a really powerful, been starting to see some interesting things, and also seeing the lack of attention to ritual in this moment as folks are trying to return to work or go back to offices after the pandemic. And this kind of idea that you would just show up and get back to work is really not working for most people. We need rituals to help us know where we've been and recognize the moment that we're in. So thinking about a tech company here in Silicon Valley that I talked with recently, where they explicitly offered a return to work ritual, not a return to work order, but a return to work ritual where they came together. They took time to circle up, and after a long time away, they took a big chunk of time to come back together, to be in a circle, to work in dyads, to get to share some of the stories of what the year and a half, almost 2 years that they weren't together. And then they actually created a space for people to bring artifacts from their time of working at home that they were ready to get rid of. And they did a bonfire at the end of the day of just like letting it pass. So rituals can be really powerful. And if we can orchestrate them from a design perspective, it helps people.
Have you seen any rituals that are specifically targeting or specifically helping with feelings of inclusion, with feelings, maybe the people who tend to feel more othered? Any rituals that target that very directly?
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen is around storytelling, the idea of a Jeffersonian dinner, the idea of a shared meal, right? Another place that so many cultures obviously have rituals around meals. But so the coming together for a storytelling meal can be really powerful and is an opportunity then for storytelling around a topic that is supportive of sharing identity. So it might be that you're sharing about a mentor. It might be that you're sharing about a ritual in your own family or tradition. It might be that you're explicitly sharing around what is something that culturally you want folks to know about. There's a ritual that we do that I learned originally from the National Equity Project called the Paseo Protocol. And probably if a listener Googles that, you might come up with a version of it. The Paseo Protocol is an invitation to, and with all kinds of rituals, you can change your questions, but the way we use it is around noticing and being explicit about aspects of your identity that may or not be visible that you would like to share. And then being able to share around questions. What's an aspect of your identity that people notice and perhaps over-index on? What's an aspect of your identity that isn't noticed that you would like to bring forward?
You also mentioned spaces and the role that spaces play. I'd love to hear an example of ways that spaces can be more inclusive, can encourage belonging, maybe versus some other practices.
Space is an incredible lever of design. I love any opportunity to get to work with space. And so often we have it. And I do think that some of the things I'm going to say can apply to virtual spaces as well. Like physical space, it's about intention. A beautiful thing to do pro belonging in terms of physical spaces is to have the spaces be story filled. So recently saw an atrium that was filled with large scale portraits. This was a healthcare space, large scale portraits of patients and caregivers in this context. And just that, it brought me into the space. It made me see a wide range of types of bodies, physical abilities, racial, ethnic backgrounds, modalities of work. Visual storytelling in space, I'll just say, I think is really powerful and very pro-belonging. The other story I was going to tell is the tech company Dropbox. I heard that they decided that they were going to be, for the foreseeable future, virtual first. So their orientation is towards not returning to the office, but rather than give up their physical spaces and real estate that they had, they shifted those spaces fundamentally to no longer be about desk space that everybody has, but rather turned it into studio spaces. So the spaces are now open so that you have whiteboards and other tools that are for about coming together so that they more appropriately allow for things like we were talking about in ritual, making a big circle, coming together. Spaces like that become really powerful. You're choosing with intention to go to a shared space because you want to be in physical proximity, because perhaps you're going to do some warm-ups together. You're going to stand up and have a standing ideation session, or you're going to preserve nooks and crannies where people can go and sketch and then come back together. I often think, too, that for any kind of collective work, thinking about space, thinking about indoor-outdoor space is really important. The kind of belonging that people can tap into just by stepping outside and being in touch with the earth or the sky, sitting under a tree, noticing and remembering that you belong to this earth can be really powerful.
Amazing. So our closing question is always the same. In his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being this dry, factual way of giving some information, and a sermon, which he calls for, he wishes to hear more sermons, is an urgent plea to change someone's life or to change our lives. So if you were given an opportunity to deliver a short sermon, what would it be about?
Well, this won't surprise you, but it would be about belonging. And it would be to always choose belonging and to use this is a podcast about design and systems. So to use our design energy towards the things that matter most, belonging being one of those, that we can choose to do the work that matters the most.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.